So Steve, I've got a deal for you. $45,000. I have a product for you for $45,000. Will you buy it?
Oh, 45. Well, I don't have 45,000 cash right now, but what sort of product is this?
I'm going to sell you a publicly available, freely available, you can download it on the web for absolutely free, public resource put out by FDA. But I want you to pay me for only 45 grand.
That sounds like a steal.
Doesn't it? I think so. And
I'm not sure on whose part, but it sounds like a steal.
That's the right word. That's exactly it. And that's what we're going to be talking about today is there's things being sold, in this world where data is so prevalent. Like we'd like to talk about big data, right? Hospital systems and everything talking about big data. Well, regulatory data is out there. It's freely available. And sometimes people hide it behind a paywall, even though you can actually get to it in a couple of clicks. And that's really what we're talking about today. So coming up next on MedTech Crossroads, right after we do some local events and some other news, we're going to be talking about what's getting sold for like somewhere between 25 and 50K that shouldn't really cost that, because we're going to show it to you today. Coming up next. All right, well, we try to keep you up to date on the local events coming up, actually the local and national events coming up in our ecosystem. This one would take you to Rockville, Maryland if you want to go to it, but cybersecurity is such an important thing that's coming into view for medical devices. This at the RAPS global headquarters. RAPS is certainly coming up in their reputation of an organization that is sort of circling the wagons for regulatory sciences. Some of us at Into are members there, and they're trying to do a good job of bringing those things together. So Cybersecurity Unauthorized is an event there. MedCon coming up next week. I will be there in Columbus, Ohio. It's co-sponsored by the FDA, the MedCon Conference. It's always good to get to these in-person conferences and talk to folks, both in the industry and also at the agency. So we're looking forward to that coming up next week. Hope to bring you some reporting on that, because this is the first time really in person with FDA folks, with very few exceptions, for the last 3 or 4 years. So this is really getting back to normal. BioSocial in the D, Matthew Himes and Company, Mish Bio, My Lead Consulting, Ann Arbor Spark, are all behind this, and it's life science networking, this time in Detroit. Founders Brewing Company, Tuesday, April 25th, 5 to 7 p.m. on Charlotte Street. So BioSocial expanding outside of Ann Arbor to Detroit should be a great event. Center for Drug Evaluation and Research is putting on a webinar for electronic systems, electronic records, and electronic signatures, also on April 25th. This is really important because how you do digital document control, electronic records, electronic signatures, all the things we just mentioned, it does matter. FDA has sometimes had to turn a blind eye to how it's being done just because systems change so fast. But as things stabilize, I believe you're going to find that this starts to take some sanity to itself. And so kudos to CDER for putting this on. We don't know for sure, but we expect that what they're talking about here is going to be cross-cutting across divisions at FDA. So it should be a useful listen for anyone who is in a startup, in a business, talking about how do we do electronic document control and signature control. We thought this one was interesting too, from RAPS. It's a webcast, it's free, The Foundations of Artificial Intelligence, a non-technical introduction for regulatory affairs professionals. So check that out. We've been talking about AI a lot on the show just because it's such a hot area, so much hype around it. But the reality is that the hype only takes you so far, right? There's all these things that you can and can't do with artificial intelligence. And when we talked the other week about predetermined change control plans, so if you're interested in AI, go back a couple weeks in the notes on YouTube. You will find us talking about predetermined change control plans, which, far from realizing the promise of artificial intelligence, that We're going to predict things that we haven't even seen before. Predetermined change control plans are really like, how do you swap things out in the middle of your algorithm, right? If you know it's going to change, how do you predict it? Well, that can be hard, but that's one of the ways they're getting some control around it to not have to completely resubmit the application for the AI/ML program. So this, if you're interested in AI and this isn't your bread and butter, this might be a really interesting webcast to listen to. Our friends over at MishBio, in addition to right now, they're engaged in a massive effort, but they still are keeping up a lot of these sorts of things, like this virtual coffee break, complimentary advice from Michigan life science lawyers. Second Tuesday of the month, 11 a.m. If you have a question, you need to talk to a lawyer and you want to get the first bit of direction, that would be the place to show up, May 9th. Also from MishBio, May 15th, the Medical Device Summit, Drug Discovery Symposium, Patient Advocacy Forum, Cannabis Science Symposium, Digital Health Forum, at the 2023 Michigan Life Sciences Showcase in Lansing, Michigan. Expect you'll find us there, and it should be a great chance to reconnect with the community. Also, if you're watching online, you can certainly scan the QR codes on each of these slides. If you're not and you happen to be listening to this, feel free to reach out to us. You can always reach out at contact@medtechcrossroads.com. Also, AdvaMed is having a 510K IDE and PMA submissions workshop, 3 workshops in the month of May. So if you want a deep dive on those, we just got an IDE for a client recently. But if you want to dig into this and learn more about it, these are some great workshops coming up. Also, we wanted to tell you about this, the venerable Midwest Growth Capital Symposium. It's always been MGCS, but the M used to mean Michigan, and now it's considered the Midwest Growth Capital Symposium, May 23rd through 24th of this year. Always a great event. This year being held at the Ross School of Business. This is not going to be over at Ypsilanti this year. It's going to be at the Ross School of Business. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. But guess what? If you want to work for FDA, they are hiring scientific and professional jobs at FDA. Of course, this is sort of a mixed bag because we told you a few weeks ago on the show that FDA is having a hard time retaining people. It's a popular place to go for a couple of years to gain some reputation, and they're having a harder time keeping people. But they are trying their best, and if that is of interest to you, and you're saying, hey, how do I get involved in this industry? And you've got a technical background, we're going to talk more about some of the options here during the news reports. But if you want to get connected, scan the QR code. And finally, on the upcoming events, the Midwest Showcase, we were asked to make sure to announce this. Now, some familiar names on the locked-in speakers. We've got Stephen Rapundlo from MishBio. We've got Tom Shehab from Arboretum Ventures, as well as a number of other folks. Another of Umber. How's that? Can I do that, Steve? Does that still come across clearly? Another of Umber. A number of other speakers, and this is still August, right? So Cleveland, Ohio, the Midwest Showcase put on by Dwayne and the others at ProjectMedtech. So thank you for passing that on. And that is our FDA and industry news. Those are the local events. We're going to go next to FDA and industry news. All right, well, you have heard us report before on this thing called third-party reviews. We're going to be talking now about third-party reviews. So let's do that right here. This is all about third-party reviews. What does this mean? If you've ever said to yourself, well, I wish that I didn't have to go through FDA, well, don't get too excited, but the answer is you don't always have to go directly through FDA. There are other ways to get clearance. Ultimately, it has to go through FDA, but maybe you don't want your main review team to be the FDA. Maybe you want to have a potentially faster route. This is the attraction of the third-party review program. We reviewed this, I think, last quarter to talk about what's actually being done. And at the time, there was only one third-party review organization that was left, really, Regulatory Technology Services. And they were the only ones filing, I believe, last quarter. Now, under the Accredited Persons Program, there are actually two that are making filings. So it's actually coming up from last quarter. And we've got the performance metrics here. So what's going through third party, and is it a good option, right? We've had clients say, I want to do third party because the motivation is that we think we can get through faster, right? We feel like it should be faster. Now, why would you think that? Oh, first of all, let's look here. The submissions are up. The number of submissions in Q1, there were about, just a little bit less than 20, and now we're up to about 35 submissions in Q2 of 2023. So that number is definitely going up. How does a submission go through the third-party review process? So the third party has a review time, and then the FDA gets it after a recommendation by that third party. FDA asks for more additional information if necessary. That's step C here. And then once sent back, the FDA reviews it and makes its final decision. So this is a recommendation-based process. You go to your third-party reviewer, you say, hey, please review this with your experts, make a recommendation on our behalf to FDA. FDA then makes a final decision with an opportunity to ask for additional information. So in some ways, that's not a lot different than a normal FDA process where the reviewers look at it, come back and say, hey, we'd like additional information. Okay, so what's the benefit? Why would you even do this, right? Because this does come at a cost, and the cost is inserting more people into the process, right? If I go to a service and they review it, if they happen to agree with FDA and FDA agrees with them, all could be well. But there's also a good chance that reviewers on one side of the table won't agree with the reviewers on the other side of the table. And I've got more people I have to convince to let this device through to the market. So why would I even think about doing this? Well, from the third party perspective, by statute, right? This is law. The FDA must provide a final decision in 30 days. How does that compare? What's 30 days? How does that relate? Well, normally, let's go over here. This is the timeline of communication during an FDA review. During a normal, traditional FDA review, not a third-party process. On day 1, FDA gets the communication. By day 7, they acknowledge it. By day 15, they conduct an acceptance review. By day 60, they do a substantive review. By day 90, they send their final decision. Now, of course, in the middle, they can just totally stop this process. They can just go, hey, stopping this somewhere in here under substantive review normally, and they can say, we need additional information. So just like the third-party process, the process can get paused. The clock can get paused like one of those chess timers. But FDA basically has 90 days unless they kick it back to you to make their decision. Okay, let's go back to the other page. 90 days is longer than 30 days. That's kind of the promise of the third-party process, right? Is if I can get a decision in 30 days instead of 90 days, that sounds better. Yeah, I saved 2 months. Cool. That's very tempting for a lot of folks. Well, is that what always happens? I'll tell you right now, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So maybe we should be talking more about averages. Does this on average speed things up? Or on average, does this take about the same amount of time? or longer. That's what we're going to get to. But first of all, let's note that there now are two, there have been all these players, right? These are all cleared partners, third-party review organizations that FDA recognizes. Beanstalk Ventures, AABB, Center for Measurement Standards of Industrial, COLA. Don't know how they made it into that list there, but COLA must stand for something, etc. Right now, the only two that are actually making filings with FDA are RTS and the third-party review group. They're the only ones who have been making this quarter filings. So the graphs you're going to look at here in a second, this is how to interpret them. The mean is the little dot in the middle. The median is the line. And the 25th and 75th percentiles are the top and bottom of that box. And then almost the maximum and minimums on this. The box plot sources, that's a name familiar to some of us. So let's look at this. Initial third-party review time. Keep in mind there's a bunch of dates and times we're going to play with here. So FDA normally, on a traditional 510K, has 90 days from receipt to making a decision. They can pause that clock for up to 180 days where they're not reviewing anymore and you are having to respond. So you got the 90 days plus as much of the 180 days as it takes you to respond to them. Here's the third-party performance data. Initial third-party review time. How long does the third party spend with this before anything gets sent to anybody? Well, the mean is a little bit over 100 days for both of these organizations. The upper 75, 75th is above that, and the 25% is below that. You shouldn't really think of this as being less than 50 days, because even the median is below or is above 50 days. So here we are somewhere between 50 and 150 days, with the mean being somewhere around 100. Okay, that's the initial review time. That's how long it's in the third party's hands. Sometimes there's hold times associated with this as well. But on total, the mean third-party review time, total third-party review time, is this north of 100 days, maybe 120-ish days. Then we look at the FDA review time. They've got 30 days, right? That's what this line represents on the graph if you're looking online. 30-day deadline. Well, FDA does seem to be hitting those 30-day deadlines. Good for them. Sometimes they're in between 20 and 30 days. That makes sense. I get that. That's cool. So here we are just somewhere sub 30 days, which means that all told, you're going to start to find numbers. Let's skip ahead here. Total time to decision from third-party receipt. Okay, so I give it to the third party, and then the third party reviews it for 100 some days. And then they give it to FDA, and FDA has it for a little bit less than 30 days, and there's some holds in both of those. That's getting us into this mean range of about 150 days. Median is about 100. Mean is about 100 and a little bit less than 150. Median, of course, is the we'll see it from this graph here in just a second. The mean is the average, right? The median is that most frequently occurring one. But what does it look like for a traditional 510K, right? So we've looked at the third party. You're somewhere in between 100 and 150 days there. I mean, yeah, and it can be way more or way less. But here is a graph from CDER, giving them credit where credit is due. They made this very nice report, and they examined 1,411 510K submissions. This is 2021 that they put this together, and they found that right here in the middle, a traditional 510K is somewhere right around, 130 to 160 days for the mean. But you also see that these cluster, there's an awful lot that get cleared, quite a few, it's amazing. They get cleared between 50 and 60 days and between 80 and 90 days. Those are probably simpler ones that go through more quickly. So what are we learning here? Well, is there time saved? Is the mean dramatically different? Is it months different? That doesn't appear to be the case. The median, in fact, actually may be lower for traditionally cleared 510Ks. The mean may be lower slightly for third-party reviewed. What is the upshot of this? How do you how do you think about this? Here's some data on decisions. It sounds like 70%, 69% of these third-party submissions result in a substantial equivalence decision. But how should we be thinking about this? Third-party, a good idea? Bad idea? What do we say about it? I think in our experience, this is it depends on the circumstance, right? Now, first of all, hey, if you're running a business and you're thinking, how long is it going to take me to get my 510K from the day that I submit it? Since both of these populations of data are kind of similar, we should be thinking in this range of, 100 to 200 days, right? That's where most of this data is clustered. But it's going to depend very much on the situation. I believe the benefit of these third-party review organizations is for devices that maybe aren't quite as novel, because the more novel it is, the more argument there's going to be with the agency. And so, in fact, if you can put something out there that everybody knows how to review, you might get the benefit of that boost from the third-party review and the 60 days that are missing out of FDA's timeline. Jury's out. We mostly wanted to report the data there so that you could see that and the two companies that are doing that. There's a bunch authorized, but only two that are doing that. And one is RTS and the other is TPRG. So that's the news on third-party reviews for fiscal year 2023 quarter 2. Next up, I wanted to talk about viral mutations. We don't talk a lot about COVID on the show anymore, and that's probably just as well. We're thankful that we are where we are. We're thankful that it seems to be going into that very much endemic stage. This is probably the first time I've mentioned COVID on the show in a year. But I found this very, very interesting because many are working on diagnostics. And FDA continues to track the impact of viral mutations on COVID-19 tests. And as I was reading this document and researching into this, it became very clear to me that this thing that we call COVID, it is, but it isn't, because the thing is always changing. I mean, we've known this for years, right? But sometimes it's interesting to be reminded how we're target seeking with diagnostics. Right? Any kind of diagnostic is looking for some kind of target. And false positives and false negatives, sensitivity and specificity are all things that matter to knowing what you're doing with that target. And of course, mutations are responsible for these changes, and they go through citing all sorts of mutations. They cite all sorts of effects on tests. I'm not going to belabor them. I did think it was interesting that the Omicron variant has significantly more mutations than previous variants, particularly in the S gene, which was one of the things that they were targeting, the gene that encodes the virus's spike protein. And so as the pattern matching, right, for those of you who are looking at the screen and maybe haven't done this before, as you have targets, you have things that are looking to line up with the sequence of that target for many types of tests. And if something happens not to be there and can't line up, it won't necessarily identify it. Well, how many of those things could be missing before you don't identify it as COVID anymore, as SARS-CoV-2? Well, that's what's sort of at focus here. So FDA goes through and they're tracking this, they're tracking test after test after test, and noting which ones are going to be impacted and which ones are not going to be impacted. For example, here are tests that do have the S gene dropout, but are not likely to be significantly impacted. Somehow it's missing information or has changes to the information, but they still believe it's going to catch enough of that to trigger a positive. So I think this is worth knowing because those of us who work on diagnostics, this is yet again simply a sensitivity, specificity kind of question, false positives and false negatives. And I can't tell you the number of times that people have come into being and they said, hey, I've got this great test and it shows this. But they've done it at such a rudimentary level that you haven't actually exposed it to the wild. You're not dealing with, maybe they're not genetic mutations, maybe it's something else, but they haven't actually seen the variability in the actual population that they're trying to address. So maybe the upshot here is, even if you're not thinking about COVID diagnostics anymore, and I hope at some level you're not, if you're involved in diagnostics, beware those trend lines that you think mean something. And if these words ever come out of your mouth, oh, we just need to optimize the model, I want you to stop and think. Because oftentimes, just optimizing the model is actually the invitation to discovery of unknown parameters, unknown variability that you didn't account for. How early can you get to that? How quickly can you discover it? That's actually a passion point for me, something that I love it when companies can encounter early so that they are not up against that challenge when it's too late to do anything about it. So, little lessons from the world of COVID once again. All right, well, we're going to go over here. Actually, we're going to save the 510K one for a minute later. Let's see if we can get to it. Ooh, we didn't have it brought up. We're going to come over here. No, it's not it. We're going to come over here. Oh, where did it go? There it is. Jobs, 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 jobs. Who wants a job? You want to work for FDA? Well, this is your chance. The Virtual Hiring Event. This is the CDRH page, Center for Devices and Radiological Health. If you scan the QR code from earlier in the show and you're interested in working for FDA, that's going to take you to a page that is one level up from this. So they'll have CDER and CBER and all these different areas. There is this virtual hiring event going on May 23rd through 25th that you can register for. But they have jobs listed in some different places here. First is this USA Jobs job site. You can go there and you can find different things. Program analyst, a consumer safety officer. There's some things happening here. Well, they've even got the salary ranges listed, 60 to 100 there. Let's go back. They've also got STEM career opportunities. They're looking for folks in biology, chemistry, engineering, epidemiology, data information science, statistics. And they've got positions like an assistant director. They've got a regulatory policy analyst, another assistant director who's a physician. So if you want to get out of healthcare and you want to go work for FDA, there's your chance. An interdisciplinary scientist working as an assistant director, and a social scientist. So a lot of options here, things that they're doing. There are also fellowship positions that don't appear on the USA Jobs site. There's a bunch of fellowships there. So the upshot here is if you've ever wanted to work for FDA, maybe you're in between things, there's also opportunities for USPHS Commission Corps, students and recent graduates. There's an internship program. And if you're wondering about working for them, here you go. This is where you want to go. You can apply through USA Jobs or through some of these other portals, or go to that virtual hiring event and take a look, see what you can find. Well, and that brings us to our main event. Steve, did you decide whether you're going to take me up on my offer? You know, I got free resources, man. Free resources that I'm only going to charge you $45K for.
You know, I'm not certain about it. I mean, it's a really good deal for you. I'll give you that credit. But I'm not sure if I'm going to come out on top with that one.
Nice. Yeah, that's exactly it, right? So who would take a deal like that? Steve, you're a smart guy. You know to see right through that one. But this is the problem. I mean, medical device development, startups, it's kind of the fog of war, right? You're in there, maybe you're a CEO, you're a developer, you're in there and you got one shot on goal for this thing. You want to make this work. You are working on limited funds. And you say to yourself, well, I could figure this all out myself, but I can't. I want to go to trusted experts and I want them to tell me what I should do, which is fine at some level, right? Saying, hey, I don't know what to do. But when you are met with a proposal that sounds like it's going to take you across that finish line, all you have to do is sign up and pay the money. It's always good to stop and check. Is that really going to get me where I want to go? Now, one of our philosophies here at Into Being is you really want to make easily accessible information free, which is one of the reasons we do MedTech Crossroads. And sure, we charge money to do work. That's fine. That's great when we really enter in and do work. But one of the disturbing trends we've seen in the marketplace is when somebody says, oh, sure, I can get you the information you need. That's going to cost you X dollars. And in this particular topic, it's often between 25 and 50K, $25,000 and $50,000. And oftentimes it's centered around the idea of, I'm going to do your 510K for you. And that sounds like a pretty reasonable offer. Hey, I've got an engineering staff. I need somebody to do my 510K for me. Well, the sad truth is that oftentimes companies find themselves in a position where that person is only really regurgitating information that is publicly available. It's on my screen right here. And doesn't actually know how to go beyond that. Doesn't actually know how to say, and so for item number C, letter C, number C, we are going to do the following. I want your designers to do this, and I need the information in this format, et cetera, et cetera. Reading a checklist for $45,000 is not really going to be value add. It's how do you go beyond that? So we want to put this into your hands, the content of a 510K. You shouldn't need to come to anyone, including me, to understand what goes into a 510K. In fact, and we will link it afterwards on the YouTube description, we have a whole series of how do you get a 510K? Is a 510K right for me? How do I develop it? What goes into it, etc. But we're going to both reference you back to that series, as well as put in your hands right here what actually goes into that 510K, so that you can ask more intelligent questions of those who would help you to understand how are they going to help you understand what to do to generate this information. So at a very, very high level, what goes into a 510K is not going to come as a major surprise. A lot of it is bureaucracy. I'm sure that makes everyone really, really happy. But right here, they actually say, in order to address the required elements, you will need the following information to assure that your 510K is complete. If you do not have this information, you should obtain it prior to proceeding. And you've heard us talk about these sorts of things on the show before, but here they all are in one place. You need to understand the classification of your medical device. The 510K is a substantial equivalence-based process. You need substantial equivalence to a predicate device, a legally marketed pre-existing device. So you need to know what your predicate device is going to be. You need final labeling. You need your specifications, including your engineering drawings, photos, etc. This comes out of your design control process. You need performance data, such as bench, animal, or clinical testing. Now, little secret here, if all you read is that, you're just going to go potentially do whatever you wanted to do. What they're not telling you, and this is a constant frustration, what they're not telling you is how to go from that design to that testing clearly. That's a place where I wish FDA did a better job of directly communicating that. Sterilization information. We talked about sterilization in recent weeks. And then what guidance documents are you following? So if you don't even have these 7 things, you're not following a 510K anytime soon. You need to understand how these elements link to each other, how to get them, and what they entail. So they're just giving you that part of the list. The real power is to understand how these things are generated. How do you think about sterilization? How do you think about your testing? How do you even design your testing? How do you know who you would go to do the testing? Those are all the kinds of questions you really want to be asking as value-add questions. Whoop-de-doo, there's a user fee cover sheet. Great, of course there is. There's another cover sheet. There's a cover letter. These things are relatively boilerplate. These are not things to get worked up over. There's a 510K acceptance checklist. We're going to talk about this in some detail. A statement of indications for use. We've talked about this a lot on the show. If you want to learn more about indications for use, there are videos you can watch. We'll try to link those in the description. There's also a 510K summary or statement. That's something that definitely needs to be crafted because it is a publicly facing document. You don't want to tell the world everything about your device. But there are certain things you need to say that will be publicly facing after your 510K is cleared. There's also the option to make a 510K statement. But the reality is this is often not a good idea. Sometimes it could be, but it's often not. It's better to just put a summary out there. Otherwise, you can get involved in some legal actions around not having put that out there. There's a truthful and accurate statement. You need to sign another document saying that you're not lying on all the other documents. So that's another one. The proposed labeling is part of it. Now, if you just say, here's my labeling, and you don't link that back to what was my design and what was my testing and what were my risks and what were my requirements and how does this all link back to my indications for use, you will be deficient. That's where the real understanding needs to be. It's not knowing what to file at this level. It's knowing how these things work together during the development process to be able to file these things, to be able to generate these documents. You need a description of the specifications of the device. You need to compare the substantial equivalence of your device to your chosen predicate device. Now, substantial equivalence doesn't mean perfect equivalence. There can be technological differences between the devices. There can be functionality differences. It's just that the new technological differences can't raise new questions of safety or effectiveness. If you never had electrical energy in the product and you test and you create a new product, if the predicate didn't have any electrical energy in it and you make a new product and it has electrical energy, guess what? You just raised new questions of safety or effectiveness. That's probably not going to be eligible for a 510K. But substantial equivalence doesn't mean identical. So there's a lot of places where you can show that you're substantially equivalent, even though you're not identically equivalent. And there's some flexibility to this, but the comparison table, they say, should identify relevant similarities and differences in areas such as intended use, target population, where it's used, ambulance use, home use, hospital, human factors, performance, materials. You go through and you compare each one of these things to your predicate device. If the predicate device was gigantic and yours is small, maybe it's not a big deal. If the predicate device was tiny and yours is huge, maybe that's more of an issue. If you're using it on a different anatomical site, well, that's interesting. It doesn't mean it's not substantially equivalent, but now you're going to have to justify those changes. If any of these things are substantially different, you're going to have to talk about why the difference doesn't matter. Performance data. Technically, clinical data is not required for a 510K, but performance data of some sort is, and this will depend on your design controls, on your risks, on your test design, ultimately what we call the verification and validation process. So again, at a very high level, this is what goes into a 510K. That list sometimes is getting sold for tens of thousands of dollars, and that's just not okay. You need to understand how that list works. And so if you're talking to somebody and saying, hey, you're going to help me with my 510K, right? I want you to ask them, with this in hand, how does this relate to that? How does that relate to that? Tell me how we're going to get to that document. What is my staff as a startup, as a product development entity, right? How does my staff get this information? Not what is the information I need to get, but how are we going to get it? That's where the real power of this is. Now, I said we'd look at the refuse to accept policy for 510Ks from FDA. Well, this is a thing that FDA does. I think that we said they had 15 days to do this from that other diagram we had. We're going to get to the table here. Long ways in. This was a long document. This one was like 100 pages. We're not going to go through the whole thing, promise. Yeah, they got 15 days to complete this. But guess what? If you know they're going to go through this checklist, why would you submit a 510K if you didn't already go through this checklist? That's just, that'd be lunacy, right? So you're going to go through this checklist as a, do we have all the things here? And I have glossed over so much language that's actually in these documents, right? I was browsing pages by, but even in these two documents, I don't care who you are, who's listening. Like, are you an engineer? Are you a company founder? Are you a venture capitalist accompanying your company, mentoring them? You could sit down with these during any appropriate juncture and say, hey, let's just spend a few minutes with these paragraphs and try to understand if we're even close. If we understand that we might be close or we might not be, then we can go talk to an expert and say, hey, we think we're on the right track, but can you really help us here? It's a much better way to approach folks than to say, tell me what to do, and then just sort of wait there. So one of the things they want to know is the product a device? And they give you the references, and you can go see if the product is a device, right? I mean, ultimately, if it's participating in the diagnosis or treatment of a disease state or condition, then it's probably a device. Are you sending it to the appropriate center? And they give you guidance. This isn't just a blank question. They tell you how to think about this. Is it a combination product? Does it act, does it have a constituent part that's a drug, like an approved drug that's already out there? Is it truly eligible for a 510K? They give you some pointers. Now, if you have trouble understanding how to answer this question, sure, go ahead and ask somebody, right? Folks at Into Being, there's many folks all over the world who do this kind of work, right? So you can go out and you can say, you know what? Am I really eligible for a 510K? I think I am, but this doesn't answer my question. That's a great question to come to somebody and ask. Am I really eligible for it? I would love it if people would come and say, I was reading the refuse to accept checklist and I encountered question 5 and I'm pretty convinced I'm a 510K, but I'm not absolutely sure. That'd be just amazing. This is informed shopping. So it goes on. Let's get down to some other interesting ones here. Do you have a table of contents? Good. Did you label all your sections? This is bureaucracy. But still, it's important because they're going to refuse to accept it if you don't have these things. Let's keep going here. They talk about, for example, clinical data. It's not required. NA is a perfectly valid choice, but they want to know if you're including that. But then if you are, there's things that you have to do. So for example, there's a financial certification form. There's a certification of compliance with clinicaltrials.gov databank. There are statements of compliance. There's all these things that you have to do, which if you forgot to include, it's like, oh, I didn't know we had to do that. Go through this list. Go through it every few months. Make sure that you're targeting all these things, that they're on your work plan in your company to get them done. They also want to know if you've made any prior submissions on this. They don't want to be the ones coming to you and saying, hey, we've been talking about this, but you tried to pull the wool over our eyes and wouldn't let us know that we had talked about this in some other way with the agency before. So they want to know about that. They want to know about voluntary consensus standards. Then there's more technical stuff, the device description. Device description information. Whether the device contains accessories. This is one that's gotten many companies into trouble because if you say you're compatible with something else, you better be compatible with it. And oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes it's almost impossible to prove compatibility with something that you sort of assumed you could. And that makes your life very, very hard downstream. So even here, this isn't just a final checklist item. This is a let's plan and demonstrate the compatibility of our device with the accessories that we know we're going to be using. Identification of a predicate device. Proposed labeling. This list goes on and on and on. The point here is not to sterilization, is not to show you every part of this list today. You can take a look at this. Just look up the FDA refused to accept 510K refused to accept checklist. There you found it. 5 seconds on Google. But as we get down to the end of this, I think the question remains, how do you, cybersecurity, don't forget cybersecurity, that's a big one coming up here. As you get down to the end of this, you could do a lot with this. If you would keep these two, you say, our company's going for a 510K. Keep these two documents in front of yourself, right? Actually just review them every now and then. Say, is that on my work plan? But then the questions are going to come up and you're going to say, I don't actually know how to do that part of it. It doesn't make sense to me. One of the things we often tell folks is that so much of this comes out of what's called design controls, right? FDA's 21 CFR 820. It's the process by which you trace your intended use into your user needs, your risks, your standards, your design inputs, which results in a later product development process, which then feeds back to testing, validation, and verification. If you really understand this process, oftentimes it illumines the rest of the 510K submission process. And so it's really important to not lose sight of design controls as being the feeder for many of these questions that are getting asked in the 510K contents or in the 510K refuse to accept checklist. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of insight. Would love it if everybody who hears this presentation just closes the door in your mind to going out there and saying, I need an expert to understand the first step of this. I'd rather you went out and said, okay, I've read these two documents. I get some of it. I don't get some of it. Let me ask some intelligent questions about the specifics. And sometimes you're going to find that the person on the other end doesn't actually know much more than you did because all they were doing was reading that checklist. And other times people will be able to unpack it and tell you more about how do you get there? How do you get there from here? But now you're the one driving the ship. You're the one asking those kind of questions. And that's how we can have our startup CEOs, our innovators, our designers, our venture capitalists, our other types of investors, mentoring stakeholders, and everybody in the community. Let's raise those boats, right? So that people are asking intelligent questions of each other. And we can get there faster and more efficiently and fail fast, like they say, so that we can get to good products that are helping users really increasing human health. So that's it on 510Ks. What goes into a 510K? Save yourself $45,000. Save it to ask the real questions, which you're going to ask once you have spent some time with those 2 documents or delegated that to somebody who can. We'll give just a minute for any questions that may come along. We're going to be at MedCon most of next week. We're hoping to have a little report on that during next week's show. Looking forward to being with you on next week's show. We'll just take a quick look here and see if there's any other questions or comments. Not seeing any. I just want to thank you so much for being with us today on MedTech Crossroads. And we will see you next week. Hopefully it's not a rainy day next week. So it's pouring rain out here in the great state of Michigan. So hopefully it's nice where you are. We'll talk to you next week on MedTech Crossroads.